Hello and welcome back to the Peter Mackay Motorsport podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in again to our podcast. I hope you've been enjoying some of the episodes we've been publishing recently. This episode today is a very special one. It's the start of a brand new series here on the Peter Mackay Motorsport podcast called The Icons of Scottish Motorsport. I'm a very proud Scot myself and have been watching motorsport my entire life, and I think a big part of where my passion and love for motor racing has come from is due to a small number of people who have been incredibly successful in motorsport who come from our wonderful country. So the idea with this series is we're going to try and tell a few stories about these wonderful people who have been so successful in motorsport from Scotland, what they meant to me personally, and the legacy that they've had on motor racing in Scotland. You can't talk about Scottish motor racing drivers unless you talk about Jim Clark. And Jim Clark is going to be the subject of our first episode, and really it's Jim that's created the lineage and the legacy for Scottish motorsport success. And throughout the series we're going to start with Jim Clark and work our way through to present day and some of the more recent Scottish motorsport stars. Jim Clark, he's particularly special to me due to the relationship that I had with my grandfather, who was a huge fan of motorsport, but particularly Jim Clark himself. My grandfather, Ian Thompson, was the chief superintendent of Fife Police, and when he retired, he set about on a charitable mission to have a bronze sculpture erected in the town of Kilmeny, or the village of Kilmeny, where Jim Clark was born. So he approached a local sculptor who was actually living in Kilmeny at the time, a guy called David Annan, to create this what turned out to be incredibly lifelike sculpture of Jim Clark. If you're ever heading, the town's just sort of between the town of Cooper and the town of Dundee. If you're ever driving past there near St Andrews, you should pop into Kilmeny and have a look at this incredible sculpture. So my grandfather, Jim Clark was his hero too, and he wrote letters to the great and good of motorsport from all over the world, and through support of many fundraising efforts, but also from the generosity of Ford Motor Company, the statue was eventually erected. To also part of I've conveniently timed the release of this podcast just at near the end of August, because next week, after years of fundraising and efforts, the Jim Clark Trust are due to officially open the brand new Jim Clark Museum in Duns, the town where Jim spent most of his life. For many years they've had the Jim Clark Room in Duns, which housed some of his memorabilia and trophies and things like that. But the folks at Jim Clark Trust, including Jim's cousin Doug Niven and his son-in-law, guy called Ben Smith, felt that it was the room needed development and something a little bit more significant to honour Jim's legacy. And I must say, the effort that they've made to raise the amount of money, millions of pounds required to build what they've done. And I haven't seen it in person yet, but the photographs look absolutely amazing of this brand new facility, which has been tirelessly worked on by Doug Niven and Ben and many others. It's you have about a week left to enter their raffle, which you can win a one-of-one Lotus Jim Clark Evora. I've bought more tickets than I would like to admit, in the hope that I might win that lovely red Lotus Evora. So the winner will be drawn next week, so good luck to any of you who have entered. Back in 2015, they held an event to announce the intention to build a Jim Clark museum in Duns, and it was on the 50th anniversary of his win at the Indianapolis 500 and his second Formula One world title. And Team Classic Lotus and some private collectors brought some of the cars which Jim competed in over his career, and they were demonstrated and being driven up and down the high street in Duns, which was just an absolute joy to attend. And I had the incredible fortune of standing watching the proceedings, and found out I was standing next to Jim's sister, which was an incredible privilege to have a chat with her as well. Quite a joy. So I really hope this episode does Jim justice. I think there's people far more qualified than me who will be able to go into much greater detail about his Formula One exploits and what really made him special. But I will try my best to tell you a little bit about Jim, maybe some things you might not already know, and just try and do justice to this great man who's inspired a lot of people, including myself. So the biggest figure that you can attribute to the most important figure you can attribute to Jim Clark is his start-win ratio. Jim Clark started 72 Formula One Grand Prix and won 25 of them, which in an era where mechanical breakdowns were very common, that is an incredible batting average, one that we hardly have ever seen again. He won the World Championship in 1963 and 1965. He also went on to win the Indianapolis 500 and the British Touring Car Championships, amongst many other significant races. He was born, as I mentioned, in Kilmeny in Fife, but grew up in the borders at Eddington Mains Farm. He actually went to a very prestigious boarding school called Loretto School, where in my final 2 years of school, I somehow managed to fluke being able to attend the same school myself. And I remember sitting bored out of my mind in the school chapel listening to whatever was going on, and I would always look behind me and you would see the plaque with in honour, in memory of Jim Clark, and that was just a nice reminder of home while at boarding school. But Jim, he left boarding school at 16 to leave to join the family business on the farm. I managed to see it to 18 until 2 years later joining my family business too. So that's about as close as my similarities to Jim Clark go. Jim was a quiet man. He was a farmer first and foremost, who got into motor racing through contacts that he had and friends that he had in the young farmers community in the borders. He was a very private man. He kept himself to himself. And it's probably a good thing he was a very private man, and that he never tried to cultivate attention in the press, which was probably a good thing, given that he was known by those around him for being quite the master of finding himself nice girlfriends on many occasions, and I'll leave it there. But a very quiet man, very private man, but very driven for success. Did it very subtly, but very, very driven, and always wanted to get the very best out of what he was doing. He had already learnt to drive by the age of 9 in an Austin 7, and could also drive a tractor at that point, which probably makes you realise why so many border farmers have become such successful motor racing drivers, as they've torn around their family's farm at a very, very young age. He, in his early days of motor racing, he raced he actually was sponsored by a good friend of his, Ian Scott Watson, and they, inspired by a team called Écurie Écosse, they founded their own team called Écurie Agricole. And through the racing with Écurie Agricole, Jim caught the attention of a guy called Jock McBain, who owned a team called the Border Reivers, who through racing for the Border Reivers, Jim really put his name on the motor racing map. Interestingly, the name Jock McBain, the guy who founded and owned Border Reivers, many years later, a guy who we'll talk about later on in this series, a guy called Jackie Stewart, was mentoring and looking after a guy called Dario Franchitti. You also may have heard of him, under the banner of Paul Stewart Racing. And Jackie, at that time, ever the marketeer, thought, well, Dario, you don't have a very Scottish-sounding name, so it's going to be difficult for us to find sponsors for you. What about we call you Jock McBain? So that was obviously where the name came from. But Dario, true to his roots, his Italian roots, said, no, my name's Dario Franchitti, and that's how it shall stay. And actually, nowadays, that was obviously a very clever decision, because a more exotic name you will not get than Dario Franchitti. Anyway, I digress. So, throughout this episode, I'm going to talk about a few of Jim Clark's exploits. Some you might know, some you might not, and just some of the most incredible things that he did over his career. Like I said, his exploits in Formula One are very well documented and very well commented about. So I will try to talk about some of the different things that he did across his career. One of the most significant achievements that Jim had was his exploits at the Indianapolis 500, one of the most important races, one of the most significant races in the world. It all started back in 1963 when Dan Gurney, an absolute legend of motorsport who we sadly lost a year or so ago, Dan Gurney was the guy who convinced Colin Chapman to build a Lotus car for the Indianapolis 500. At that point, it was dominated by Offenhauser specials, and it was very much in an American-dominated race at that point. Dan Gurney would be Jim Clark's teammate at the Indianapolis 500 for Lotus in 1963, 1964 and 1965, the only 3 years that Jim was competing there. In order to get a feel for the track, after the 1962 Formula One Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, Jim Clark went to Indianapolis for a test in his 1.5 litre, 170 horsepower Formula One car of the time. But on arrival, Jim did 100 laps and found the whole experience quite uninspiring, actually. He did his work and went home, but he was absolutely furious and offended by what he found when he reached Indianapolis for this test. The officials who organised the event had organised for current Indianapolis 500 drivers to come along and watch Jim, to check up on him to see if he was doing everything correctly. And Jim found this deeply offensive, and I can see exactly why, given that in 1963 he would absolutely clean up in the Formula One World Championship. In 1963, Colin Chapman produced a car called the Lotus 29, which had an engine, a Ford 4.2 litre engine that was actually developed from the Ford Fairlane road car at the time. The car, in sort of typical Lotus fashion, it was slower on the straights than the much larger American cars, but was much more faster and nimble in the corners. In the race, in his very first attempt at the Indy 500, Jim Clark, with 30 laps to go, was catching Parnelli Jones at the rate of 1 second a lap and was due to catch him and pass him. However, with just a short amount of time left in the race, Parnelli Jones's car shed oil all over the track. Now, according to the rules of the Indianapolis 500 at the time, if your car was seen to be shedding oil, it should be black flagged and disqualified and taken off the track. This did not happen, and a number of drivers crashed as they passed over the oil. Parnelli Jones took the opportunity to do his final pit stop under the yellow flag and subsequently won the race. Jim Clark was absolutely furious about being wronged out of this win, and was determined to show that he had the ability to win the Indy 500, but he would get his chance. Sadly, that chance would not come in 1964 when Chapman and Clark returned with Lotus to the Indianapolis 500. Chapman had done a deal with Dunlop to commission a specially made tyre specifically for the unique demands of the Indianapolis 500. However, it was all at the last minute, and to be honest, it was a bit of a calamity and a disaster. Clark, during the race, his tyre exploded and blew out, and he crashed as a result. A lap later, Dan Gurney was called in due to Clark's tyre failure. Ford and Colin Chapman fell out over this incident. So 1964 was really an Indy 500 to forget, no fault of Jim Clark's. When 1965 rolled around, Jim Clark was not really keen to actually go back to the race. However, he felt that there was unfinished business and that he had very much had a point to prove. But the good thing was, all of the ingredients were in place for Clark to give it his best shot at winning the Indianapolis 500. Ford had taken a little bit more control of the operation and had strong-armed Chapman into a deal where they were in a bit more control and were supplying the engines. Ford insisted on the use of the more preferred Firestone tyre, which had won many Indy 500 races up to that point. A firm called Meyer Drake were commissioned to build the engines, and this is the same firm that had built the absolutely dominant Offenhauser engines up to this point. So Clark had the car, the Lotus 38, he had the engines, the Meyer Drake built engines, and he had the correct type of tyre. So everything was in place. A bit similar to what Fernando Alonso did a couple of years ago when he missed the Monaco Grand Prix, regarded by most as the most significant Grand Prix of all to win. Clark did the same back in 1965. He missed the Monaco Grand Prix in order to compete at the Indy 500. I think it's amazing that even today, the Indy 500 and the Monaco Grand Prix, two of the most significant races and two of the unofficial Triple Crown, of course, often fall on the same weekend. I find it absolutely fascinating that that's still the case and that was the case back in the 1960s. But Clark felt that Colin Chapman had put all of his eggs in the Indy 500 basket and kind of taken his eye off the ball a little bit from races like Monaco. So he decided that he would go and give the race one more go. The rest is history. Clark went on to win the race. In doing so, was the first European winner winning in 49 years. So it was a momentous victory for Jim Clark and Lotus. However, Colin Chapman had the slight embarrassment of having to follow through with one of the Indianapolis 500's many traditions, not getting soaked with a bottle of milk. But after the win, Jim Clark and Colin Chapman did a parade lap in the pace car from the race. The only problem was that this pace car was not a Ford, it was in fact a Plymouth. And due to what is still a tradition to this day, the winner of the Indy 500 race gets to keep the pace car from that particular year. So Dario Franchitti, he still has his 3 IndyCar pace cars still locked up in his garage at home. Jim Clark, though, he sold the Plymouth pace car at the request of Ford and was provided with a Ford Galaxy that he could register in the United Kingdom and take back to the farm in the Borders. What a lucky boy. So it's the Indy 500 was something that was very much a reserved playground of the American oval specialists, and what Clark and Chapman did with the assistance of the Ford Motor Company was just incredible. And if you look at the efforts of Fernando Alonso and McLaren in the last couple of years, when Fernando Alonso came to have a go at the Indy 500 and led the race in the Andretti McLaren car. It was just amazing to watch a current Formula One driver take on the Indy 500 for the first time in many, many years. And I sincerely hope that these great races like Indy 500 and Le Mans and things like that will attract more one-off appearances from Formula One drivers and other drivers from significant motor racing series. So all of these things, they just add to the mystique and the legacy and the stature that Jim Clark is held in. Jim Clark is regarded as one of the greatest motor racing drivers who has ever lived, and I think he fully deserves those plaudits. So where was Jim Clark's happiest hunting ground, certainly in terms of motor racing anyway? One particular, when I was doing a bit of research about him, one particular place where it looked like was a very happy hunting ground for him was Zandvoort on the coast of Holland. Now, Zandvoort, if you've ever been there, it's an absolutely beautiful beach town in Holland, and if you like fried fish, there's all the way down the seafront, you've got these catering vans which do this wonderful fried fish called kibbeling. So maybe fueled with the kibbeling, Jim Clark went to win all these races at Zandvoort, perhaps. In 1960, Zandvoort was scheduled to be Jim Clark's first race. He was actually due to drive an Aston Martin DBR4, but the car ended up not being ready in time, and Jim was released from his contract to Colin Chapman. And ever since that race, he never left the employment of Lotus, which I think is a very, very cool and special thing. In 1963, he won by over a lap from Dan Gurney. In 1964, he won by a minute from John Surtees. In 1965, he won by 8 seconds from Jackie Stewart. In 1967, he won the first ever race won by the iconic Cosworth DFV engine. Now, if you were to think of iconic names in motorsport, Gurney, Surtees, Stewart, Cosworth DFVs, all that history that was written on the Dutch coast by Jim Clark, I just think is absolutely incredible, and it just shows you how high a level Jim Clark was operating at when he was in his prime. Absolutely unbeatable. Now, one thing that I found most interesting about doing more and more research into Jim Clark is the list of cars that he's competed in and the significance of the cars that he competed in. Now, again, I'll say the cars he raced in Formula 1, you're going to need someone far cleverer than I to talk about the nuances and the difference between them. I'm actually going to focus a little bit more on some of the road-based cars that Jim Clark competed in, and some cars that you might not know so much about that he competed in. And when you look down the list, it is just an absolute dream garage. The Lotus Cortina, the Lotus Elan, the Lotus Elite, the Jaguar D-Type. It's just mouth-watering, the list of cars that he competed in. And probably the road car that Jim Clark made most famous was the Lotus Cortina. Lotus Cortina is a car which you now see at the events like the Goodwood Revival and Goodwood Members Meeting, tearing around with the world's top touring car drivers with one wheel cocked up in the air. And the great thing was that this was still the case 50 years ago. Jim Clark, I think, made the Lotus Cortina and cemented what makes it such an iconic and valuable and special car to this day. He debuted this car, this Lotus Cortina, in practice at Oulton Park in 1963. At the wheel of the Lotus Cortina, Jim Clark, he won 18 class races in the British Saloon Car Championship and won the 1964 championship at the wheel of this car. So what he did for that car is just amazing. He won the Sebring 3-hour in 1964 and 1965 at the wheel of a Cortina, and led his class in the iconic Sebring 12-hour until a wheel collapsed. There is one particular special example of Lotus Cortina that has been preserved in immaculate condition to this day, and it is a significant car. The registration BJH417B. It's now owned by a guy called Dario Franchitti, 3-time Indy 500 winner and 4-time IndyCar champion. Now, Dario Franchitti is a trust member. He's a trustee of the Jim Clark Trust and has been instrumental into supporting the new Jim Clark Museum, and has very generously loaned his prized possession, BGH 147B, to the museum. And this is a car that was raced by Jim Clark in period and won countless races. And Dario is a self-confessed Jim Clark geek, and even has a Jim Clark room in his house. And this, talk about the ultimate piece of Jim Clark history. What a car that you can just turn the key and take out on the road and drive. I'm just so jealous. The value of a car like this is almost impossible to quantify. To give you an idea, when Tom Walkinshaw's estate was broken up and sold back in 2003, he owned a Lotus Cortina that sold at the time for £90,000, long before the current madness of classic car values that we see today. So I hope that gives you an impression to how significant the Lotus Cortina is in the Jim Clark story. Another really cool thing that he did with the Lotus Cortina was that Jim Clark competed in the RAC Rally in 1966. Bearing in mind this was a top-level rally at the time, competed over 5 days and 3 nights, non-stop virtually. He won 3 stages. Amazing. Imagine that now, just somebody coming off the Formula 1 grid and stepping into the Wales Rally GB and winning 3 stages. It just wouldn't happen. It's just impossible. He ran in the top 10 for most of the rally and unfortunately had 2 crashes towards the end of the event. But for the remaining days of the event, he didn't just get into his private plane and fly off. No, he stayed and helped the Lotus mechanics. Isn't that amazing? The guy of this stature, one of the most powerful, most successful, richest guys in global motorsport, was prepared to roll his sleeves up, get his hands dirty, and help his team who had been looking after his car up to that point to help his teammates. I personally think that says a lot about what the sort of guy Jim Clark was. But he took this very, very seriously. This was no publicity stunt. Nothing that Jim Clark did was a publicity stunt, through choice at least. He took coaching from Roger Clark, his namesake, who was a very successful British rally driver at the time, and who, incidentally, was a Lotus dealer as well. The whole exercise was set up by Ford PR boss Walter Hayes, who he's also a very significant man in the history of Scottish motorsport, given the support that he gave Sir Jackie Stewart during his career. You can just imagine in the late 1950s, early 1960s, that Jim Clark learning his craft as a young border farmer, tearing around the countryside from in between young farmers' dances. It's an amazing thing to imagine what that must have been like to grow up in that era and to have had the joy and the pleasure of knowing somebody like Jim Clark, a man so talented and so successful. The Lotus Elan, which is a car I just covet so much. I would love to own a Lotus Elan. He won a GT race with the Lotus Elan at Oulton Park, but actually Jim's exploits with the Elan were much more significant on the road. He owned a beautiful little yellow Elan which he had as a company car back in 1967. And this car he cherished so much. He owned the car when he was living in Paris as a tax exile at the time. And he actually was, at the time, it was known that he spent a lot less time in travelling by plane and actually travelled to most of the European races in his little yellow Elan. When Jim, not long before Jim sadly passed away, his friend Jaby Krombach, who he knew in Paris, had kindly gone and got the car taxed for him, and he came to meet Jim at the airfield as he was boarding a flight to say, "There you go, here's the papers for the Elan. I've had it taxed and the papers up to date." And Jim said, "No," he says, "I've got a new company car arriving this week. You have it. You'll enjoy it just as much as I do, just as much as I have." Sadly, Jim would never get to see Jaby enjoy the car because sadly he passed away later on that week at the tragic accident in Hockenheim. And Jaby enjoyed the car for the rest of his days, driving it regularly. And when he was as he approached his later life, he handed the car to Peter Windsor. This specific little yellow Elan is now looked after by the Jim Clark Trust, and specifically Jim's cousin Doug Niven. Now, I actually have my own little story with this wonderful little yellow Elan. Earlier this year, on the 7th of April, on the anniversary of Jim's tragic death, my girlfriend Lucy and I were taking part in the Border Reivers Rally in my Lotus Exige. And we went to, as part of the rally, we went to visit a guy called Andrew Cowan, who has a beautiful farm in the Borders and has the most amazing collection of rally cars, both from his time as a driver, but also his time as a team manager, and it was just a privilege to attend. But at the event, the Jim Clark Trust were there, and Ben and Doug were there selling raffle tickets for the Lotus Evora Jim Clark car to raise funds for the new museum. But they brought along the little yellow Elan. So they asked me, would you like to put your car up, your yellow Exige up beside the Elan for a photograph? And for me, this was enough. That had made my day. It had made my year, quite honestly, having my yellow Lotus parked beside Jim Clark's very own car. It was quite an emotional moment, I must be honest. And we were chatting away for ages to Doug, and to be able to chat to a man as knowledgeable and as kind and as and caring as a guy like Doug, and obviously a guy who's done so much for the legacy of his cousin Jim. We were chatting away for ages, and we were sort of loitering around, and Doug comes over and he says, "Oh, why don't you go and have a little run in the little yellow one?" The little yellow one, Jim Clark's actual Lotus Elan. And of course, I couldn't quite believe that I was offered this opportunity, and I still don't. And it's still one of the most cherished moments I'll always remember. So my girlfriend Lucy and I, we hopped into this little Elan, could barely get into it, it's a tiny little car, and drove up and down Andrew Cowan's beautifully tarmac drive. It's an experience I will never ever forget, to sit in Jim's seat, steer Jim's steering wheel and shift around his gear stick, and imagine all those wonderful trips he must have had across Europe competing in Formula One. It's an experience I'll never forget and will always be grateful of. Anyway, the Lotus Elite was also a car which was really significant in Jim's early days as a motor racing driver. He actually raced the Lotus Elite in 1959 at Le Mans. He ran the car as a road car with a special David Hobbs Mechamatic gearbox. It was actually the first Lotus that he ever drove in competition, and curiously, this was in a race with Colin Chapman. So on Boxing Day 1958, the previous day, on Christmas night, Jim Clark and Ian Scott Watson had taken the overnight train from Berwick down to London. Once they'd arrived in London, they headed to the Green Park Hotel and picked up their Lotus Elite and drove it down to Brands Hatch. Can you imagine that now? Just taking the overnight train down, picking up the car, turning the key, driving it to the track, doing your race and driving it home. To be honest, for me, that's just the stuff of dreams, and it's something we sadly don't really see anymore in motor racing. So this race between Clark and Chapman, it's strange to think about them racing against each other. We're both in Lotus Elites, and Colin Chapman reported at the time, which is when Jim went past him like he was standing still, he was going, "Who on earth is this beating me in my own car?" Sadly, Clark was clipped by a back marker and ended up falling back to second, and Chapman actually won that race, which I'm sure he liked reminding Jim about. Talking of that race at Le Mans in 1959, now up to this point, Jim Clark had remained loyal to his Border Reivers team, and he'd actually denied two approaches from Colin Chapman, saying that he was loyal to who he was racing for, and that he wasn't interested. But Colin Chapman, he had lots of tricks and tactics and ploys to get what he wanted, and I honestly think that Lotus as a brand would be long gone. It would be a long lost brand if it wasn't for the tenacity of a guy like Colin Chapman. And he was not perfect, and there's been plenty of stories about certain financial impropriety and things like that. But I'll try to focus on the positive things that he did and what he needed to do to keep Lotus cars going and to make it into such a successful racing team and to make such iconic road cars. He had to really duck and dive and do some quite questionable things to do this. So in Le Mans 1959, the Border Reivers had been given an invite to race a Lotus Elite. So the plan was that Ian Scott Watson would buy the car and Jim would go and race it along with a guy called Dixon from who was a garage owner in Perth, who was going to race alongside him. However, Colin Chapman spotted an opportunity. What happened was he decided to deliberately delay the delivery of the car and let the Border Reivers down, so the Border Reivers had to pull out of the race. Meanwhile, Colin Chapman contacted the ACO and managed to sort of quietly manipulate them into allowing him to enter the car under Team Lotus. Once he'd managed to get this entry and taken the Border Reivers entry, he contacted Clark and asked if he would like to compete in the race alongside Sir John Whitmore. Clark said, "No, you've let us down, and this was our entry, and you've really let us down here." So the answer is no. But they managed to come to a compromise, and Border Reivers ended up running the car, and Jim Clark and St John Whitmore carried on and competed in the race. Now, Le Mans was a race that Jim Clark was not a fan of, due to the fact, he says, there is no chance that you can have 120 people who are good enough to drive together on the same circuit. So driving standards was something that was already a concern of his. Now, today at Le Mans, you have it still has a pro-am element to it, and I must be honest, the amateur drivers who do compete in Le Mans, they do come under criticism, but you cannot expect them to drive at the same standard as a professional racing car driver, and Le Mans would not be what it was without wealthy people who are willing to put the funds behind a pro-amateur program. But Jim Clark did make a very important point there back in 1959 about driving standards and how we must never forget, even today, about that importance. So, what legacy has Jim Clark left behind in Scottish motorsport? Well, one thing that he did in his later part of his career was that he was a fantastic mentor to Jackie Stewart, and the two of them were thick as thieves, often finishing 1 and 2 on the podium when Jackie came into Formula One. And Jim gave Jackie so much counsel in his racing, and they were actually coined as Batman and Robin at one point. They were known to stay when they were in London in Sir John Whitmore's flat and get up to all sorts of nonsense. And I think that the guidance and the training and all of the counsel that Jim gave to Sir Jackie, I think actually laid down the foundation for a whole line of icons of Scottish motorsport. Because of course Jackie, in conjunction with his son Paul, with Paul Stewart Racing, laid a platform for many of Scotland's fantastic motor racing drivers, who we will cover a lot throughout this series. Also, Jim, he was a hero to many racing Scots. He still is Dario Franchitti's hero. He's a hero of so many Scottish drivers, and for me, he is right up there as one of Scotland's greatest ever sportsmen. Full stop. A double world champion at Formula One, IndyCar winner, British touring car winner, but also the way that he carried himself. He just had this amazing humility, but complete confidence in his own ability, which he could keep under wraps and then just go onto the track and devastate the opposition with the most smooth driving style. Of course, there isn't so much onboard footage from the 1960s, but there is one particular video which I've watched many times over of Jim Clark at the wheel of a Lotus, and it looks like he's driving down the shops. And I think that beautiful smooth style was something that I think he actually passed on to Jackie Stewart, and it's something that which you'll see. It was a real style that really worked in the era. And it's an era of Formula One that we'll never really see again. It was obviously, thankfully, it's an era we'll never see again in terms of safety. Formula One is far, far more safe than it ever was, and Sir Jackie Stewart has a lot to be responsible for that, of improving all of the safety. But the idea of drivers travelling together and having dinner together and going on holiday together, I think is just a fascinating one, and it's one that you don't really see now, or you don't see at all in Formula One, and not really in motorsport as a whole. So I think Jim will always be very fondly remembered, and I think it's just a testament that nearly 50 years after his first, or nearly 60 years actually, sorry, after his first ever Formula One race, he's still loved by so many fans in Scotland. And I'm sure when the new museum opens next week in Duns, I'm sure it will be incredibly busy with people of all ages. And again, I cannot stress it enough. Well done to all you guys at the Jim Clark Trust for making that a reality. Well done to every single person who donated to the cause. I know that his family will be incredibly proud of all of this effort, and I'm sure Jim himself would have been completely blown away by the efforts made. So please get yourself down to the new Jim Clark Museum, go and enjoy it, go and learn about the great man. I certainly will be, and I look forward to speaking to you again with the next episode in the Icons of Motorsport series. Thanks very much.